Hey everybody, hope you guys are doing well. Just coming with a new lecture video here. I'm also recording from a new part of my house so you can see a little bit of the art here. That might be exciting to you, but probably not. Um, I've been thinking about you guys a lot. Miss seeing you. Please keep emailing me questions, anything you guys need. Also, email me your recommendations, TV, music. Someone sent me a playlist. That was awesome. I loved it. So, what are you watching? What are you listening to? That's fun for me. We're all quarantined. We need some good content here. Okay. All right. So, what's the plan for today? I'm going to talk a little bit about modernist fiction. So, I talked about modernism generally, kind of as a movement. Talked about how that worked in poetry. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that works in fiction, just to get us set up for these 2 days, for Fitzgerald and for Hemingway, who are two modernist fiction writers. Okay, so that's the plan. I'm gonna then talk a little bit about F. Scott Fitzgerald, and then give us again some entry points into this text. I hope you enjoy this story. I think it's a really interesting story. If you've read Great Gatsby, it probably is gonna be a little bit familiar. So hopefully that's of interest to you. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about elements of modernist fiction. So, like their poetry counterparts, the modernist fiction writers were responding to the historical moment. So that's the rapid changes in technology, in urban development, and in kind of new theories of time and space, new scientific theories, new ways of understanding the world. So they're responding to this historical moment. I think maybe even more important for fiction writers than poetry is World War I. If you think about the major American modernist writers, Fitzgerald and Hemingway being two of them, they are really concerned about issues around World War I or the aftermath or the effect of World War I. Something like Hemingway especially. Well, what did World War I bring? Well, this idea of disillusionment, and these figures have been called the lost generation. So why are they called the lost generation? Well, there's a lot of people who moved away from the United States during the post-World War II era, and there's a lot of kind of search for meaning happening both in their individual lives, but also in their texts. So a lot of disillusionment about the modern world, and along with that, anxiety around this progress. So the society at large was excited about these new innovations. A lot of these writers were concerned about what kind of effects this had on individuals. What was this leading to? And I think especially in how did it affect the individual people. So we see a lot of that kind of anxiety around this progress. Okay, in terms of like form or style, there's a very clear rejection of realism as well. So we talked about realism, we read some realist stories. They're really focused and had this kind of belief that you could gain knowledge from something that you saw. This belief in kind of empirical ways of knowing. Well, the modernist writers are going to be rejecting that. So rather than this focus on objective knowledge, the modernist fiction writers are really concerned about the subjective experience of reality. So what is the subjective experience of reality? And I'll talk a little bit more about how that kind of plays out. And I think with new theories of psychology developing, so thinking about somebody like Freud, there is a kind of move into the inner life of characters and the attention to the inner life of characters rather than the kind of external reality in which characters are put. So a very clear kind of break from realist tenets or realist ways of writing. So just to keep going a little bit more with the style here, there's a lot of experimentation and innovation in narrative structure and voice. And each writer is going to be doing their own thing. Just like the poets, everybody has their kind of own modernist project, their own kind of ways of experimenting. But I think with modernist fiction, you can see a lot of focus on the internal subjective experience of reality. And that's going to shape the structure and the voice of the narrative. So the narrative voice and how the structure, how the narrative is kind of put together. So how does an author build the narrative, right? So if we think about realism, they're going to be building on this kind of understanding of the world as this objective space, both in time and space. Here, it's going to be much more about experience. So how is somebody experiencing time and space? And what is the kind of psychological movement? So this is when we get, kind of techniques like, just lost it, stream of consciousness. So trying to kind of structure a narrative based on the movements of the mind. We move into the inner life of characters. So a book like Ulysses, so I have the picture here of Ulysses, which is one of the, if not like the preeminent modernist text, is going to be almost, the voice is almost going to be completely the kind of thoughts of the characters. So moving or structuring and framing a narrative around the thoughts, the inner life of characters. Also, there's some interesting things about time and how kind of new ways of understanding time structured or moved the writers to structure their texts or their fiction in different ways. So they're really going to explore the experience of time. How do we feel, experience, kind of live in time, rather than viewing time as this kind of objective system? I think we can maybe see that a little bit in Winter Dreams, and I'll talk more about that. Okay, so that's modernist fiction. I would just want us to think a little bit about how kind of what's new in their writing as compared to the realists. And I think you read something like Winter Dreams, you read something like Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, and you see that it's quite a bit different than something like To Build a Fire, or even something like Yellow Wallpaper. So like, let's think about Yellow Wallpaper, which is the thinking about the experience or the kind of the following the mind of a character, but that is a journal. So it's using this kind of structure of the journal to get into the mind of the character. Well, if you're in a modernist text, you don't need that framework of a journal. You just are entering the mind of a character, and that's going to be the narrative voice. So I hope you can see the difference there. If you don't, if that's not totally clear, send me an email and we will talk about it. Okay, so let me talk about F. Scott Fitzgerald. Here's a nice picture of him. He looks very 1920s here with his middle part. So who is F. Scott Fitzgerald? So he's born in Minnesota. So I think that's significant when we're thinking about this story, Winter Dreams. So there seems to be something autobiographical, perhaps, happening in the text. Although he lived a lot of his life, or he grew up quite a bit in upstate New York. So, but part of what's interesting here, so during the modernist period in the United States, New York was the center of culture. So it's interesting to think about kind of these writers that are coming from outside of that center of culture. So, and how that kind of frames or structure or frames their own mindset or shapes their mindset. Okay, so, and like Dexter, he goes to school back east, goes to Princeton. He doesn't finish there, but there's a kind of striving that you can see in Fitzgerald's autobiography toward like upper class existence. So I think that's just kind of interesting background for Winter Dreams. Okay, so he leaves college to join the army during World War I, but he actually doesn't see combat. But while he's stationed in Alabama, he meets a young Southerner named Zelda Sayer. Zelda Fitzgerald, so they eventually get married after he he sells his first novel, and it's a huge success. So Zelda comes from money. She's a Southerner, so there's a lot of, kind of tradition happening there. Actually, The Site of Paradise, in some ways, is autobiographical in the way it depicts a relationship between a Southern girl and this man who wants to marry her. Okay, so she's a really significant part of Fitzgerald's life. She is both, I would say, a creative partner and creative, in some ways, rival to Fitzgerald. It's come out that he lifted some ideas and phrases from her journals. She also tried to be a writer and has one novelist that was received really poorly. It was incidentally edited by Fitzgerald. Anyway, so Zelda's an interesting figure, and together they formed this, kind of became this couple of the Jazz Age. They embodied what the Jazz Age was about. So him gaining wealth very young through his writing, kind of becoming new money, and we'll talk a little bit about this in Winter Dreams. But so he became new money, and they lived very excessively, but they also lived in debt. And so really Fitzgerald and Zelda together embodied the excesses, the kind of joy, excitement, energy of the Jazz Age, but also the melancholy, the anxieties around kind of the wealth and excesses of that time. So Fitzgerald lived in New York City. He was an expat. He lived in Paris for a while. Zelda was actually suffered mental breakdowns and was institutionalized for a lot of her adult life. And I mean, their lives end very sadly. Fitzgerald dies, I think, when he's 44 from excessive drinking. He's trying to become a screenwriter in LA. So that's a little bit about his biography. I think you can see kind of how it informs his themes and his writing, especially if you read something like The Great Gatsby. I'm going to be maybe like mentioning The Great Gatsby a little bit just because it's so familiar. A lot of us had to read it in high school, and there's so much reflected in The Great Gatsby from Winter Dreams. It's almost like he's trying out some ideas in Winter Dreams for Gatsby. Okay, so what's his style and what are his major themes? I would say his major themes here are the American Dream, and we see them all in Winter Dreams and in something like Great Gatsby. So exploring and kind of digging into the American Dream. So how does he do that? Well, he explores this idea of old money versus new money. So people who gain wealth or people who inherit wealth and the kind of natural conflict that happens. We see that in Winter Dreams. Dexter is new money. We see that in The Great Gatsby. Gatsby is new money. So also exploring this idea of the desire to achieve status and wealth and kind of the belief in the American Dream, this idea that hard work can bring you status and wealth and can bring you kind of like whatever you desire. But underneath that, his stories really show that this desire is empty. Okay, so that's one of his major themes here, and connected with that is he's the chronicler of the Jazz Age, right? He's the chronicler of the excesses, of the energy, and I think you can maybe see that a little bit in his prose and his style, but I think maybe even more in Great Gatsby. There's a kind of energy there that's tapping into the really kind of optimism and the just party attitude of the Jazz Age, okay? And his style. So I think you could see in his style, there's a combination of this really straightforward narration with lush use of figurative language, similes everywhere. It's a really kind of interesting part of this story, how he's kind of trying to concretize feelings or kind of impressions through similes. So similes are comparisons using like or as. Like even just at the very beginning of the story, talks about winter like shutting like a lid. So you seeing these kind of interesting use of figurative language throughout the story and his writing. He's also very experimental and innovative in his narrative voice and structure. You can see that in Winter Dreams. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But something like Gatsby. So who's the narrator of Gatsby? Well, I forget his name, but it's the cousin of Daisy, the friend of Gatsby. So this kind of outsider telling the story of these other people. So that was actually really experimental and innovative at the time. So he's trying to find new ways of presenting narratives and exploring narrative voice, and then exploring new ways of building a story. Winter Dreams, I think, is really an experiment in how to depict coming of age without like all these details, right? So how do you kind of create something impressionistic, but also show, or how do you focus on one aspect of a person's life, maybe a relationship, and how does that show something about the development of that person? Okay, so he's really experimental in this way. Okay, so what I want to do is talk through the discussion questions, because these are the kind of like main issues I think I see in this text that I want you to explore. So I want everybody to hear about all 5 of these and kind of get like some entry points that way. So I'm gonna go to Canvas and we're gonna look at these, like each of these together. Sound good? Okay, so let me go there. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit more about this, but let me do this. Okay, sorry, that didn't work. Okay, this is totally fine. So I'm keeping the discussion board as one long thread. It might be a little bit more cumbersome for you to read or to kind of look through, but it's a lot simpler for me to grade, honestly, and so I need to keep it this way. Because of that, I want you to label your response with your group number. So when you post, make sure to say this is response group 1, 2, whatever, just so that's clear to me. And then whenever you reply to somebody's discussion, please put the name of that person that you're replying to so I know who you're responding to. Okay, so that would be really helpful. Okay, these are a little bit more structured in terms of how I want you to respond. So let me just kind of talk through all 5 of these, because I think they also offer entry points, like I said, to the text. So the first one is kind of about what we were just talking about, kind of these innovative methods of structuring narrative. So I want you to think about narrative structure here. So modernist writers, Fitzgerald specifically, was experimenting with new ways of ordering a plot. How do you build a plot? And presenting elements of fiction, like how do you present setting, how do you present characters. So experimenting with narrative structure, like I said earlier, is a significant way modernist fiction rejects the tenets of realism, which followed the confines and order of chronological time. So it was there wasn't flashbacks, right, in a realist text. It was a story kind of following time. So that's something that he is exploring here in Winter Dreams. And so for the first response group, you're going to be examining Fitzgerald's narrative structure in Winter Dreams. So the first thing I want you to do is just think about, how would you describe this? In my mind, the word I would use is elliptical, right? So ellipses are those ... dots. They kind of represent a space or kind of a breath in a sentence. That's the same in this story, right? There's kind of jumps in time. There's breaths or spaces within the different sections or the different stories that he tells. So how would you describe it? How would you talk about this narrative structure, how this narrative is built? So you can think of different ways, different words, different even metaphors that you would use to describe this. Okay, so when we do that, we're noticing something, right? We're noticing something about the form of the text, the structure of the text. So we're kind of taking an analytical eye on the text and saying, okay, the form, or Fitzgerald constructs the text in this way. Now I want us to ask, like, what might these choices mean for the story? So how does this connect to like larger themes of the story? So I have two directions that you can take. And again, I want everybody to think about this too. That's why I'm putting this on the video. So first of all, I want you to think about time. So what's happening in terms of time and this structure? So there's a part that Dexter says he wants to, or he thinks he wants to lessen the gap which lay between his past and future. So how might this narrative structure relate to that passage or to this idea of combining past and future? What does that say about how Dexter experiences time, or in this story, how this story wants to express or show time? Okay, the other thing I want you to think about is how might this kind of narrative structure relate to the character's search for meaning in the modern world? We know Dexter is searching for something. He's searching for some kind of foundation. He's searching for some kind of stability through wealth. Well, does the story offer that? What is the narrative structure doing, and what is it saying about Dexter's search for stability? Okay, so that's kind of an entry point to this text. So thinking about issues of form and structure, and then connecting to issues of theme and subject. All right, so it's kind of looking at how the story is constructed, and then connecting it to and asking questions about why. Okay, why does this happen, and what significance does it have for larger themes in the story? Okay, so group two. You're thinking, so clearly one of Fitzgerald's major themes is issues around the American dream. Well, the story is called Winter Dreams. And so you can see, I think, in Fitzgerald's work, the kind of belief and the joy in the excess and energy of the Roaring Twenties sits side by side with the disillusionment of kind of the 30s after the Great Depression or after the stock market crash. So he's often exploring kind of how do those things sit side by side. And this was written before the stock market crash and the Great Depression. So you can even see, like, in the midst of the excesses of the Jazz Age, there's something kind of melancholic about this search for wealth. I want us to think specifically about Winter Dreams, right? Why is this called Winter Dreams, and how does this connect to Fitzgerald's exploration of the American dream? So the one thing you're going to do is just describe, what are Dexter's winter dreams? What does he desire for his life? Okay. So we pointed out this major theme in the text: Dexter's desire for wealth and his belief in the American dream, his belief in hard work. Now I want you to look at, like, specific passages that connect to this idea, and think about the significance of this theme. So what does Fitzgerald want to get across to his readers? What is he trying to say about this theme? So again, you have two choices here. You can take it in different directions. Why is it called Winter Dreams? So this is the first one here. Why winter dreams? Winter is a time of coldness, and a time of, like, if we think about cold and kind of freezing, we don't come to mind like the desire or birth of something new, or birth of dreams. So what is the significance of Dexter's dreams being winter dreams? What is Fitzgerald trying to say? You might look closely at this passage. It's the first time Winter Dreams is used. So what does this passage suggest about Dexter's desire for wealth and status? Why is it winter dreams instead of summer dreams, instead of spring dreams? Those to me seem more positive. Winter seems somehow negative. So explore that a little bit. So how might Winter Dreams, the story, be a warning against idealizing the tenets of the American dream? So in what ways does Fitzgerald show that the American dream is really a sham? Do you think this is a warning? One thing that you might look at is the final few paragraphs of the story. I think we see a real sense of loss here, right? Dexter is where he wanted to be. Now he lives in New York, so it's the center of culture, the center of business. He has money, he has wealth, he has status, and there's this profound sense of loss at the end of the story. So what is Fitzgerald trying to say here? Okay, so this group, I'm asking you to explore the text through a theme, so thematically. So the first group, we're looking at form and structure. This we're looking at theme. So how are you exploring through a theme? Okay, group 3. So this one, I'm asking you to explore symbols in the story. So I kind of define what symbols are in a literary text, so a symbol has a layered meaning. So, for example, William Carlos Williams to Elsie, the deer running in the goldenrod. It's actually a deer, right? It's a deer in the poem, but it also represents something more, something abstract. So we also live with symbols. So literary texts kind of use symbols in a variety of ways. They use these layered meanings of a symbol to express something in the text. But we also live with symbols. We have status symbols that speak to something about us. So if you own a Tesla, say, what does that say? Well, a Tesla as a status symbol is going to say, like, well, you have money for a Tesla, right? They're not cheap, so that it shows kind of your wealth, but it also means you're environmentally conscious. So the things that we have, the things that we own, the stuff that we have is also speaking symbolically to the people that we interact with. So Winter Dreams uses both kind of symbols. So the symbols in this text that I want us to explore are also symbols of status. And so I want us to think about how is Fitzgerald using these symbols and the layered meaning in these symbols. So the 3 things that you can explore, so for whoever's in this group, but anybody like thinking about this text, think about houses, boats, and golf, right? So how are these functioning in the text? I want you to look at specific passages that are connected to one of these symbols and think about what do they suggest about how people view these status symbols? How are they connected to bigger ideas, bigger themes, bigger issues for Dexter, for Fitzgerald? So for houses, think about the first time that Dexter goes into Judy's house, the first time he sees it. What is he seeing? How does he understand this status symbol? How does that connect to his desire for wealth and status? So with boats, so think about the couple times that we really hear about a boat. So that first time that Judy kind of drives in, Dexter's swimming, he's laying out on the dock, and she drives up. What does this say about Judy, that she's always driving in like a speedboat? There's another time where she escapes a guy that she doesn't want to be around anymore. She goes off in a boat with somebody else. So boats and Judy, there's something really interesting going on there. And then lastly, golf. Like, what kind of symbol is golf? It's not just athletic achievement for Dexter, right? Why does he work at the golf course? He gets pocket change, but there's something else going on. Like, why does he quit when he might have to be a caddy for Judy when she's a child, right? So what's going on with golf? So look at those specific passages. I think one of the richest passages connected to golf is when he goes back out on the club after he's like made his money and come back to Minnesota. and he's out on the golf course with some people that he used to caddy for, and he has some interesting reflections. So how does golf serve as a symbol? Okay, so these questions are asking you to examine Fitzgerald's use of symbols and then draw larger connections to the themes in the story. Okay, group number 4. So this one is this group I'm asking you to explore through character, this story through character, specifically the character of Judy. So Winter Dreams is in third-person limited narrative point of view. I'm just going to tell you guys that, right? So it's third-person limited point of view. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means the perspective is limited to Dexter. So the events of the story focus on Dexter, and the depictions of the other characters are filtered through his perspective. So this point of view has significant implications for how the reader understands Judy as a character, right? So who is Judy? Who is she as a character? So the first thing I want you to do is just write 2 or 3 sentences about your initial response to Judy. How did you feel about her as a character? Okay, so then I want us to really kind of dig in and examine that. How is the text structured, or how is Judy presented in a way to shape our perception of her? So we see Judy through Dexter's eyes. So how is that going to shape our perception of her? So you can use one of these questions here, and I think it's important to think. About in this text something that was happening historically at this time. So the 1920s, not just the jazz age, but it's also the age where women, for the first time, were kind of experiencing an unprecedented amount of freedom. So there was freedom in the way they dress, freedom in movement, and kind of what spaces they were allowed in. So that's an important historical context for a character like Judy, who really does express a lot of freedom. So these questions I want you to think about. First of all, it is about this narrative point of view. So if our perspective is filtered through Dexter, well, how do Dexter's biases and attraction to Judy shape the way he sees her? Right? He has certain desires for status and wealth. And in some ways, those desires are embodied in this character. So how does the way we see them, or the Fitzgerald presenter, shaped through Dexter's perspective? Okay? All right, the second 2 questions are about this historical context. The first one is, do you see a kind of empowerment in who Judy is? How do you think Fitzgerald is maybe showing the new possibilities of freedom, and how this is might be a good thing? Okay. Another question, and if you want to combine these, you can. There's also a lot of anxiety around the new woman, the newfound freedom that women had. So Winter Dreams is written by a man, and I think we can tell through his biographical experience with his wife, I think there is some concerns, and he might have shared these anxieties around this newfound freedom. So how might Judy's experiences in the narrative express anxiety about the newfound freedom of women, and how might it be read as probably an unfair warning to women of this era? Think about where Judy ends up, how this friend of Dexter at the end describes her. Okay, so this is through character. So we're exploring this story through character and through this discussion post, or this response post. Okay, lastly, I want you to really think about the narrative voice, not in terms of how it's filtered through Dexter's perspective, but how it sometimes intrudes into the narrative. So again, there's something connected to time, I think, here. I'm thinking specifically of the part where right after Dexter quits his job, it kind of just jumps to him after college. So we don't see those things. So there's something about the way the kind of narrative voice intrudes and kind of moves through time, that Fitzgerald is doing something interesting here. So the first question is really asking about that connection to time. The next one is asking you to think about specifically the moment of this. It's on 989 in my book, but it starts. I have the whole passage here. This story is not his biography. So there's this narrative intrusion. What does this do to the narrative? What does it suggest about Fitzgerald's purpose and focus in the story? So how is he kind of using a narrative voice that intrudes into the narrative, and what is that doing or saying about Fitzgerald's purpose in this story? Okay, so those are all of the discussion questions. Remember, please label your group at the top of your response post so I know which group you're part of. I can figure it out, but that would just be easiest for me. And then anytime you respond to somebody, please make sure to label their name. Okay? So, this is Winter Dreams. I think hopefully you guys will enjoy it. If you have questions or responses or any kind of like ideas that you want to just bounce around with me, please shoot me an email. I'm excited to read your discussion posts. Let me say this, the discussion posts have been really good so far. I've in kind of writing responses to each discussion post so you know kind of why you got the grade. You should know the grade, why you got the grade you got. I do want you to dig a little bit deeper into the actual text. So if you can bring out words or phrases, try not to use like super long passages, but anytime you can bring a detail from the text into your response post, that will be great. Okay, so that's Fitzgerald. Let me know if you have questions. Hopefully you enjoyed this text and that there is something interesting in this video. All right, talk to you guys soon. Bye.